There is a version of you that is rational, calculated, and precise. That version makes decisions based on evidence. It weighs consequences. It reads people accurately. It protects you. But that version does not always show up. In fact, there are specific moments, predictable, identifiable moments, when your brain quietly steps aside and hands the controls to something older, more primitive, and far less reliable. And the dangerous part is not that this happens. The dangerous part is that you will not notice when it does. You will feel certain. You will feel clear. You will feel like you are thinking, when in reality, you are reacting. And every person who has ever lost power, made a catastrophic decision, or been manipulated by someone far less intelligent than them, did so in one of these moments. This is not a warning. This is a map. What you do with it is your problem. Something offends you deeply. Your brain does not go into analysis mode. It goes into war mode. The prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for logical reasoning, long-term planning, and social calculation, gets systematically overridden by the amygdala, which operates on a single binary, threat or no threat. The moment you feel offended, you have already lost access to your most important mental tools. You cannot accurately assess the situation. You cannot read the other person's true motive. You cannot calculate consequence. All you can do is react, and your reaction will almost always cost you more than the offense itself ever could. Machiavelli understood this intuitively. He observed that men who are easily offended are easily controlled. When you show someone that a word, a gesture, or a sight can destabilize you, you have handed them a lever. And intelligent operators, the ones who understand power, will pull that lever deliberately. They will say something calibrated to provoke you, not because they are emotional, but because they want to see you become emotional. Your offense is their intelligence report. It tells them exactly where your weak points are, how quickly you can be destabilized, and how predictably you will respond when pushed. The brain in offense mode also engages in what psychologists call attribution error at an accelerated rate. You stop seeing behavior and start seeing character. The person did not simply say something, they revealed who they really are. They did not simply act, they proved their malicious intent. This cognitive collapse from behavioral observation to character judgment happens within seconds, and it corrupts your entire read of the situation. You are no longer analyzing what is actually happening. You are prosecuting a case you have already decided the outcome of. This is not thought. This is theater performed inside your own skull, with you as both judge and jury, and reality as the party that never got to speak. Certainty is not clarity. This is perhaps one of the most uncomfortable truths in all of cognitive psychology, and it is one that most people will spend their entire lives avoiding. The feeling of being right, the subjective internal sensation of certainty, has no reliable correlation with actually being right, none. The brain generates certainty as a byproduct of cognitive coherence, not as a signal of objective truth. When your beliefs align, when your memories confirm each other, when your narrative feels internally consistent, the brain produces a feeling of rightness. That feeling tells you nothing about whether your model of reality is accurate. Psychologists refer to this phenomenon in part through the concept of the Dunning-Kruger effect, but the problem is actually deeper and older than that framing. What you are dealing with is a brain that rewards coherence over accuracy. The moment you believe something strongly, your brain begins to selectively filter incoming information, amplifying evidence that confirms the belief and muting evidence that contradicts it. This is confirmation bias operating not as a quirk, but as a feature. Your brain does this to conserve energy. Updating beliefs is metabolically expensive. Filtering information to preserve existing beliefs is cheap. So when you feel most certain, you are often in the deepest state of selective blindness. Machiavelli said that men deceive themselves more readily than they are deceived by others. This is not a moral indictment, it is a mechanical observation about how the mind operates under the pressure of self-interest and ego preservation. The moment you feel absolutely certain you are right in an argument, in an assessment of another person, in a strategic decision, that is precisely the moment to apply maximum skepticism to your own position. Not because you are necessarily wrong, but because the feeling of certainty has demonstrably zero predictive value. It is neurological noise masquerading as signal. Excessive, unsolicited kindness is one of the most underappreciated vectors of manipulation in human social dynamics. And the reason it works so reliably is because the brain is wired to interpret kindness as evidence of good intent, genuine care, and trustworthiness. This wiring made evolutionary sense in small tribal communities where social bonds were survival mechanisms. In complex modern environments populated by strategic actors, it is a catastrophic vulnerability. When someone is unusually kind to you, particularly when there is no obvious established reason for that kindness, your brain begins to suppress its threat detection systems. You feel warm, you feel comfortable, you feel seen. And while you are feeling all of those things, you are being read, assessed, and positioned. The mechanism is well documented in social psychology under the framework of reciprocity. Robert Cialdini identified it as one of the primary principles of influence. When someone does something for you, your brain generates an almost involuntary obligation to return the favor. But what is less often discussed is how this mechanism can be deliberately activated through kindness as a precursor, not a response. Someone gives you something, time, attention, praise, a favor, and now your brain registers a debt. That debt makes you psychologically pliable. You are more likely to agree, to trust, to share information you should not share, to grant access you should not grant. The kindness was the investment. You are the return. Machiavelli once said that it is better to be feared than loved, but what he understood beneath that formulation was something more precise. Love, or the simulation of love, creates dependence and vulnerability in the one who receives it, not in the one who gives it. The strategic operator who deploys kindness does not feel it. They observe your response to it, and your response, the warmth, the opening, the lowering of defenses, tells them everything they need to know about how to proceed. The next time someone is suddenly and intensely kind to you without an established foundation for that kindness, do not ask yourself why you feel good. Ask yourself what they are building toward. The brain does not simply slow down when you are exhausted. It reorganizes its priorities in ways that systematically compromise your judgment while preserving your subjective sense of competence. This is the insidious architecture of cognitive fatigue. You do not feel as impaired as you are. Studies in neuropsychology have consistently demonstrated that individuals who have been sleep-deprived for 24 hours show decision-making deficits equivalent to legal intoxication, and simultaneously rate their own performance as adequate or only slightly diminished. The impairment and the awareness of impairment disconnect from each other. You lose the ability to accurately assess how compromised you are, precisely because the tool you would use to make that assessment, your judgment, is the thing that has been compromised. In this state, the brain reverts to cognitive shortcuts at an accelerated rate. Heuristics that are already oversimplified become even more reductive. You become more susceptible to the first explanation offered rather than the most accurate one. You become more likely to agree, not because you have assessed and consented, but because disagreement requires the kind of sustained cognitive effort that an exhausted brain will not spend. You become more emotionally reactive, while simultaneously becoming less capable of identifying or managing that reactivity. The emotional centers of the brain remain energized, in some cases become hyperactive, while the regulatory systems that would normally modulate them are running on reserve. This is why rooms where critical decisions are made are sometimes deliberately kept uncomfortable. It is why negotiations that reach late hours tend to produce agreements that one party later regrets. It is why anyone who wants something from you will sometimes benefit from your exhaustion. An exhausted mind is not just a slower mind, it is a more compliant one. It seeks resolution over accuracy. It wants the cognitive burden lifted. And the fastest way to lift cognitive burden is to agree, to trust, to yield. If you find yourself making a significant decision while physically depleted about money, about a relationship, about a professional agreement, the only correct move is to make no decision at all. What feels like clarity in that moment is almost certainly fatigue wearing the costume of resolve. The individual human brain, despite all its flaws, has certain capacities for independent assessment. It can disagree. It can hold an unpopular position. It can notice when something feels wrong. The group brain has almost none of these capacities, and the moment you enter a group dynamic, particularly one with defined social hierarchies, shared identity markers, or emotional momentum, your individual cognition begins to dissolve into something far more primitive and far less reliable. This is not metaphor, it is documented neurological reality. Social conformity activates brain regions associated with perception itself, meaning you do not simply decide to agree with the group, you begin to actually see things differently because the group sees them differently. Solomon Asch demonstrated in the 1950s that a significant proportion of individuals will contradict the clear evidence of their own senses when surrounded by people who assert a different reality. Subsequent neuroscience has shown that this is not mere social compliance, it is perceptual distortion. The group is not just changing your behavior, it is changing what you perceive. And when you're inside that dynamic, you have no subjective experience of the distortion. You feel like you are seeing clearly. You feel like your assessment is your own. You feel like your conviction is based on evidence. It is not. It is based on social alignment, and those are categorically different things. Machiavelli observed that men in groups lose the capacity for individual accountability, therefore individual judgment. The crowd does not reason, it contagions. The emotional and behavioral state of those around you becomes transmitted to you through mechanisms that bypass conscious evaluation entirely. This is why mobs form. This is why markets crash in panics that no individual analyst would have predicted. This is why entire populations can be moved to positions that, in isolation, most of them would have rejected. The group does not elevate individual cognition, it submerges it. Any decision you make inside significant group pressure, social, professional, or familial, should be re-examined in solitude before you commit to it. What you believe with 10 people in the room may not be what you believe when you are alone, with only the facts. The brain's reward system is not designed to evaluate. It is designed to pursue. When dopamine floods the prefrontal cortex in response to a perceived opportunity, a new business deal, a new relationship, a financial prospect, a sudden chance at something you have wanted for a long time, the neurological effect is not enhancement of judgment, it is suppression of it. The evaluative, skeptical, analytical functions of the brain are metabolically deprioritized, while the motivational and approach-oriented systems accelerate. You become oriented toward the target. Details that should concern you stop registering with the weight they deserve. Risks that would normally trigger caution feel manageable or even irrelevant. The opportunity feels real, significant, and rare, and that feeling itself becomes the primary evidence you use to justify pursuing it. This is the cognitive architecture that predators in financial, romantic, and professional contexts rely on. They are not necessarily more intelligent than you. They do not have information you lack. What they have is an understanding of how to trigger the reward response at the right moment, at the right intensity, with the right framing. They manufacture urgency, because urgency compresses the evaluative window. They manufacture scarcity, because scarcity amplifies the dopamine signal. They manufacture social proof, because the group dynamic compounds your individual excitement. And while your reward system is running at full capacity, your risk assessment system is running at a fraction of its normal function. You are not making a decision at this point. You are being moved. Machiavelli was precise on this point. He wrote that men are so absorbed by the present that they do not consider the future consequences of their present enthusiasms. The solution is not to suppress ambition or opportunity recognition. The solution is to create a structural delay between the feeling of excitement and the execution of the decision. The excitement is neurological information, not strategic intelligence. It tells you that your brain perceives an opportunity. It tells you nothing about whether that perception is accurate. Any significant decision made in the peak of euphoria, financial, relational, strategic, should be required to survive a minimum of 48 hours of unexcited re-evaluation before you act on it. Most will not, and that is the point. Everyone carries a story about who they are. Some of those stories are flattering, some are self-critical, some are both. But regardless of content, the brain has an extraordinarily strong preference for having that story confirmed by others. This is not vanity, it is identity stability. The brain treats its self-model as something to be protected and preserved, and confirmation of that model generates a reward response similar in structure to other forms of pleasure. This means that someone who accurately or strategically reflects your self-narrative back to you, who tells you that you are exactly who you believe to be, will trigger a neurological reward that makes you feel understood, seen, and deeply connected to them. This is one of the most powerful and least discussed manipulation vectors in human social dynamics. It does not require false flattery. It does not require lies. It simply requires accurate observation of your self-concept and deliberate reflection of it. You believe you are misunderstood. Someone tells you they finally understand you. You believe you are smarter than the people around you. Someone tells you they can see your intelligence. You believe you have been treated unfairly. Someone validates that narrative completely and without reservation. In each case, the reward is the same, a deep, warm sense of alignment. And the cognitive effect is the same, a suspension of critical evaluation of the person generating that reward. Machiavelli said that men are governed more by appearance than reality, and nowhere is this truer than in the management of identity. The most dangerous person in your proximity is not necessarily the one who challenges you. Challenge activates scrutiny. The most dangerous person is often the one who perfectly validates you, because validation activates trust, and trust deactivates the very faculties you would need to assess them accurately. When someone consistently tells you what you most want to hear about yourself, the correct response is not gratitude, it is suspicion. Not because the validation is necessarily false, but because the effect of perfect validation on your judgment, on your defenses, on your willingness to extend trust is identical whether the person is genuine or strategic. And you, in that moment of feeling seen, are not equipped to tell the difference. Love is not a cognitive state. It is a neurological condition. And like any condition that alters brain chemistry, it has predictable effects on the capacities you depend on for accurate perception and sound judgment. The research is unambiguous on this point. Romantic love, particularly in its early intense phases, systematically deactivates the prefrontal regions associated with critical social assessment, negative emotion processing, and the evaluation of others' trustworthiness. You do not simply choose to see the person more favorably. The circuitry that would generate unfavorable assessments is literally running at reduced capacity. You are not looking at the person through rose-colored glasses. You are looking at them with a partially disabled analytical system and experiencing the output of that system as clarity. The implications of this are severe and largely unacknowledged in the way people discuss relationships. Information that should register as a warning sign does not land with appropriate weight. Behavioral inconsistencies you would immediately identify in a stranger or a colleague become invisible or reframed in the context of someone you are infatuated with. Agreements you would never make under normal cognitive conditions feel reasonable. Agreements you would normally require more time to evaluate feel appropriate to make immediately. And the person on the receiving end of your infatuation, whether they intend to exploit it or not, has more access to your compliance, your resources, and your trust than virtually any other actor in your life. This is not an argument against love. It is an argument for structural awareness. If you are in the early stages of intense romantic attachment, your brain has been pharmacologically compromised in specific and documented ways. The decisions that feel most obvious and most clearly motivated by insight during this period are the ones most likely to require revision when your neurochemistry stabilizes. This is why Machiavelli's political operators kept their emotional lives carefully separate from their strategic ones. Not because emotion is weakness in the abstract, but because emotion in specific moments produces specific forms of blindness that can be exploited by anyone paying closely enough attention. Loss destabilizes the brain, not just emotionally, but architecturally. Grief, the psychological and neurological response to significant loss, reorganizes cognitive priorities in ways that are profound and often lasting. The processing capacity that would normally be allocated to environmental scanning, social assessment, and strategic planning gets redirected toward the internal work of integrating an absence. This is not malfunction, it is the brain performing necessary maintenance, but it creates a window, sometimes a very long window, during which your judgment is compromised in ways you may not feel or recognize. In acute grief, the brain frequently engages in what is sometimes called magical thinking, a loosening of the causal reasoning that normally governs your assessments. This loosening can make you susceptible to narratives, promises, and framings that you would dismiss under normal conditions. People in grief sometimes make large financial decisions, significant relationship commitments, or major life changes during this period, acting on a subjective sense that something is finally clear, when in reality, the normal cognitive filters that would generate doubt or caution have been temporarily disabled by the demands of emotional processing. The clarity that grief sometimes produces is not strategic insight. It is often the quieting of complexity in a brain that has run out of bandwidth to maintain it. This is a period when the people around you, even those with no conscious intent to exploit, will have a disproportionate influence over your decisions. Your need for comfort generates compliance. Your search for meaning generates susceptibility to strong narratives. Your reduced capacity for independent evaluation makes you more dependent on whoever is nearby and available. Machiavelli noted that men are most easily moved during periods of external disorder, and internal disorder, the kind that grief represents, operates by identical mechanisms. The disorientation is real. The decisions that come from it are often ones you will spend years attempting to understand, let alone undo. When you believe you are being observed by an authority figure, by peers whose opinion matters to you, by anyone you have assigned evaluative power to, your brain shifts into performance mode. This is documented. It is called the observer effect in social psychology, or the Hawthorne effect in behavioral research. And while the standard observation is that people perform better when watched, the more precise and uncomfortable truth is that people perform differently, optimizing for the appearance of competence, social approval, and conformity with perceived expectations, rather than for actual accuracy or effectiveness. You stop trying to be right. You start trying to look right, and those are not the same cognitive operations. In this state, you are not making decisions based on your actual assessment of a situation. You are making decisions based on your model of what the watcher wants to see. You are not selecting the most accurate information to share. You are selecting the most socially viable information. You are not pursuing the most effective strategy. You are pursuing the strategy most likely to generate approval. This creates a systematic bias toward conformity, toward safe options, toward whatever narrative the evaluating presence seems to endorse. Your original judgment, whatever it was before you became aware of being observed, gets progressively edited and filtered until what remains may bear very little resemblance to what you actually think. The people who understand this use it constantly. They position themselves as evaluators, as people whose assessment matters to you, and then they wait. Once you perceive them as an audience whose approval you require, you begin to censor and perform without being asked to. You do their work for them. You will avoid positions you know they dislike, not because they have argued against those positions, but because disapproval is an aversive stimulus your brain will preemptively work to prevent. Machiavelli once said that the wise man does what great men of the past required of themselves, not what the crowd currently demands. The ability to think and decide in private, independent of the imagined audience, is not a social skill, it is a strategic one, and most people have never developed it. Success produces a specific neurochemical environment that is almost never discussed in terms of its cognitive cost. The period immediately following a significant win, a financial success, a competitive victory, a social triumph, floods the brain with dopamine and simultaneously generates something psychologists call outcome bias. The tendency to evaluate the quality of a decision based on its outcome rather than the quality of the reasoning that produced it. You won, therefore you reasoned correctly. The logic is backwards, but the brain does not care. It registers the positive outcome, associates it with the decisions and behaviors that preceded it, and increases the probability that those same decisions and behaviors will be repeated, regardless of whether they were actually the cause of the success or simply coincidental with it. This is how people who get lucky once become catastrophically overconfident. The luck does not register as luck, it registers as evidence of judgment, and the next decision gets made with elevated confidence, reduced scrutiny, and a model of the world that is inflated by the previous outcome. The risk tolerance increases, the caution decreases, the willingness to consider alternative perspectives drops, and the brain, now running on elevated dopamine and elevated self-assessment, is operating at a fraction of the skeptical capacity it would bring to a neutral situation. The moment after a win is the moment you are most likely to make the decision that eventually undoes it. Machiavelli was direct about this. He observed that fortune is a woman, and to keep her down, it is necessary to beat her and knock her about, not out of contempt, but because she favors the bold who approach her with some violence, rather than those who proceed coldly. What Machiavelli understood was that success creates complacency, and complacency reverses the conditions that produced the success in the first place. The cold, calculating approach that generated the win gets replaced by the warm, confident expansiveness that the win generates. And in that expansiveness, the errors compound. Never evaluate a decision by its outcome. Evaluate it by the quality of the reasoning that preceded it. Those are different things, often very different things.
Your brain is not your ally, it is your instrument. And like any instrument, it performs differently under different conditions and fails in predictable ways when those conditions exceed its design parameters. The moment described here, offense, certainty, flattery, exhaustion, group pressure, euphoria, validation, love, grief, observation, and success are not random. They are identifiable. They recur, and in every single one of them, the subjective experience is the same. You feel like you are thinking clearly. You feel like your judgment is sound. You feel like you know what is happening and why. That feeling is the most dangerous part, not the distortion itself, but the confidence that accompanies it. The operating principle is this: the moments when you feel most certain are the moments that require the most external verification. The moments when you feel most clear are the moments that the most scrutiny is warranted. Not because you are fundamentally unreliable, but because the conditions that produce false certainty are precise, consistent, and entirely indifferent to your intelligence, your experience, or your self-image. They work on everyone. They have always worked on everyone. The only variable is whether you know which moments they are. Now you do. What you do with that knowledge is entirely your own problem. If this kind of analysis is what you have been looking for, no comfort, no noise, just the cold mechanics of human behavior laid bare, then Behavioral Blueprint is where you need to be. Subscribe to the channel. Every video goes deeper. Every video costs you something comfortable. That is the point.